Welcome back, everybody. Today, I wanted to talk about a historical figure who I think is really interesting, mostly because he was made a character, a fictional character, but like based on reality, in a show which I really enjoyed, which I watched on Netflix. Like I watched like every episode in the entire series in like I think like maybe 3 or 4 different instances. I watched the show like again and again, and I really enjoyed the show because I've heard comments about like Breaking Bad. This is like several years ago. If any of you remember like Breaking Bad, I watched Breaking Bad, and Breaking Bad was okay, but I never really got like too excited about Breaking Bad, to be honest. And I guess different individuals bring it up because I'm like bald and I like shave my head, so I guess that's like the point, I guess, whatever. But Breaking Bad wasn't like too interesting to me. And I really liked the show The Office, which is now like really old, really cool show. But that's like sort of a comedy. And the difference is, with this show, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, the character was a real life human. And he was like really, I wouldn't say that he was likely a good human or he was like necessarily moral, but I guess he didn't have access. He was probably like an atheist, I would assume, or like a pagan at best. And given the conditions of his life, things didn't look really good for him to be too religious in any way. But his name was Spartacus, or his name, based on what they said in the show, was his slave name, I guess, was Spartacus. And I just checked online, and he was actually, I checked on Wikipedia, and he was born in present day Bulgaria. So he was a Bulgarian, because I think in the show they talk about how he was like a Thracian, and that's like his ancestry, or that's his like genome group name. But present day Bulgaria, so he was like approximately what a Bulgarian is, or he would have been today what a Bulgarian is. And he was a soldier fighting with the Romans, and then he gets taken as slave. And he is a leader eventually in a slave uprising called the Third Servile War. And the show I watched on Netflix was just like a dramatization of when he has a wife and he gets taken as slave after he works with the Romans as a soldier, and then his sort of, I would say, like struggle with his view on life, on what was happening to him, because he was being forced to fight as a slave gladiator, until he eventually rises up and he kills his slave masters. He like butchers them, I believe with knives is what happens, and then they escape, and then the slaves just continue a war and try to escape from Italy and are unable to, and are murdered basically by the Romans. But so if we're talking the ancient Romans, we're talking a population who Jesus Christ was very anti, and gave his life to work against. And then subsequently we have the Jews, for instance, who went into Europe and continued, despite what may seem to be the case, continued to follow Jesus Christ, who was, again, Jesus Christ, I've said several instances, 100% human, never God, just a human prophet and Messiah. But he went against the atheist or pagan Romans. Some might say they're pagans, but possibly they're considered atheists. And he gave his life, and he was crucified, as far as we understand, based on what they're saying in the West. He was crucified and he was able to live after, but I guess this was like the basic limit of what he was able to do. And so Spartacus is a little bit earlier in history than Jesus Christ. So I guess like within a century earlier, approximately, than Jesus. Almost exactly a century. It separates their birth, I would say, or like when they're like adult humans. So Jesus Christ was, crucified. So we're talking about a death penalty, a form of capital punishment, a form of execution. But in the case of, and Jesus Christ, as we understand, as many of us understand, was a king of the Jews when he was crucified. I guess when he entered Jerusalem, he was technically a king of the Jews, as God would allow. And he was, executed by crucifixion while being a king. But Spartacus is different. Spartacus was in league with the Romans, and he gets taken slave, and I don't understand what exactly the process was, what made him be taken slave, because there's a dramatization in the show I watched. But anyways, so Spartacus in the show, I guess Andy Milder was the first actor, and then he passes away in real life. Andy Milder, the actor who played Spartacus, he passed away after the first season, and he gets replaced by a different actor whose name I'll possibly bring up later. But anyways, I enjoyed Andy Milder the most at the beginning. But the show was really interesting to me because it did like a lot of things which I didn't think would be too interesting for me, because like I wasn't like super interested in Greek history and Roman history, even though now I understand the importance, definitely. But so the show has like a lot of themes going on, like Spartacus getting his like vengeance, basically, because he loses his wife. They bring his wife and she's like dead. They sort of murder her, and he wants to get revenge. And so basically he's the type where the entire instance he's a slave in the show. He's trying to find a way, with varying levels of intensity, or like as opposed to like covering his own tracks. He's trying to find a way to overthrow his slave masters, and of course win. He wants to win because he doesn't want to die as a gladiator. But he wants to overthrow his slave masters, and this really reminded me of what happened where there wasn't an ability to make the Middle Eastern a slave very early, again, after what happened in Egypt with the Jews. But after, Englishmen and, West African blacks and their descendants in the Americas, and then the Amerindians, they sort of team up with the help of many women across the world. They sort of team up to make it seem like, as you can see on YouTube, if you look at certain video clips, they make it seem that black humans were in like the worst form of slavery, and they survived, and they should be popular, and they should be praised. And this was a tactic which eventually will have been shown to be anti the Jews, specifically, to make less, if it were even possible, because God, of course, doesn't allow this to happen to his chosen people, but to make it seem less like important what happened to the Jews, and to make Ham genome, like beginning in Egypt, to just be like less evil than they were. This sort of reality is what was happening. This is like the conspiracy that was going on. But it actually leads to Holocaust. What happens? It leads to Fagdom, it leads to Holocaust, it leads to genocide of the Middle Eastern for like a century now. And now we have a second type of slavery, a second what the Egyptians were. And it's by those groups I mentioned. And it's been disproportionately in the West, Europe, Africa, North America, South America, and I would assume also Australia, working together against Asians. And essentially we have a situation where, for example, Shia Muslims like myself are held as a slave. Our fathers can be beaten, our mothers can be tortured, even with severe illness, diseases like cancer. We can be attacked and beaten despite what level of education we're at. The women are same as what was happening earlier in history, but the women are with those who have the power. So like the slave masters have the slave owners, master is different, but the slave owners have access to the women, and the women betray who we are, like non-ending, only, exclusively betray us and are anti what we are. And there's like severe genocide, but so Spartacus isn't really an ally specifically, because he's, like I said, likely an atheist, or like a pagan, or whatever he was, and he murders. And we know in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." But at least he was anti the Romans. So we know Jesus Christ was anti the Romans, and we know that with Muhammad, for instance, and with Ali, the recentering of what is to be popular and what is to be correct. It was likely closer to like the Mediterranean Sea, and closer to what Rome is. But we have with the allowance of the Quran and what happens with Islam, we have Mecca and Medina, for instance, to recenter towards Shem genome, towards those humans who are higher holy, what the center of mind and hands will have been of humans. So anyways, though Spartacus rises up against the Romans, and it seems like they were then different than we are now, generally. Different than I, never what I am, but generally what humans who aren't speaking out against, for instance, like nuclear bombing of Iran being a possibility. All won't have really spoken out too heavily, unless I haven't seen them, but all won't have spoken out too heavily against this, because for instance, the parallel is like, well, with Japan, there was Pearl Harbor, where they flew airplanes and bombed Pearl Harbor. But I've explained in several different videos and in the comments in response, it was Sunnis who did, Sunni Muslims, not Shia Muslims. So Sunni Muslims who did the September 11th attacks. It was Sunni Muslims who did the October 7th attacks. It was Sunni Muslims who were ISIS. Okay, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim. Okay, so this is really important to remember, but within what Spartacus was and what he symbolized, there was at least violence against the evil oppressors. Okay, so this isn't really a parallel, but at least the USA, where I am of, at least with the evil being insanely high in the US, and what the plans are, at least there was an attack on the Axis powers in World War II when the Holocaust was happening, and the Jews were at least freed after those who remained alive. But it was like a conspiracy. It was just like a time thing where they set it up and they were aware, or they didn't put enough time together to prevent this sort of thing. And there was this century-long, black is stronger, black is, in terms of the skin color of West African descended humans, they're stronger, they're faster, they're better, they're higher. They can do what no one else can do, no individuals can do besides them. And this further destroyed what the Jews were in Europe, for instance, because the Jews were generally whiter skin or tan skin at the most, and they weren't performing very well at sports at the moment, and these sort of things. So, we have this sort of disastrous situation going on, and then we see the Armenian genocide begin. And the Armenians are Asians, the Armenians are Middle Eastern, specifically if we talk about the region in Asia. And so we see the Armenian genocide, we see the Holocaust, we see war after war after war in Asia, on the the east side of Asia and the southeast side of Asia. And then we see this continue until a terrorist Sunni group attacks the Twin Towers, and then we have nearly now a quarter century of war within those who are essentially Shia and allies of the Shia. Basically, that's what's happening. It's not specifically directed 100% at Shia Muslims, but it is disproportionately, like, for instance, those who attacked the towers were of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and none of the war is essentially at Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, even when Pakistan, for instance, harbors Taliban from Afghanistan. There isn't like too much of a response anti the Sunni Muslims who commit the higher atrocities. So anyways, they're the only population, the only group who attacked any Sunnis disproportionately compared to attacking solely Shia. The only group is really actually the Jews, God's chosen people. I'm not saying I'm in favor of the Palestinians being attacked, but Hamas is a Sunni Muslim group, and the Jews attacked Hamas and you could say the Palestinians disproportionately. So the USA attacked almost entirely Shia heavy nations, like nations with a heavy Shia population, or nations then allied to Shia nations. In terms of the physical reality. But so anyways, I wanted to pose the question just to leave you with this, because I do recommend the show Spartacus, a really interesting show. It could be not your sort of thing to watch, but I wanted to leave you with the question, is the enemy of your enemy your friend? Different than ally or protector or whatever, but different than a friend also. But are they someone to be praised in what they do, aside of any evil they may do? But are they doing something good? Because slavery we do not accept, and Spartacus was a slave, and he was rising up against slaveholder Romans. And later on, Jesus Christ, for a different reason, not entirely because of slavery, but Jesus Christ rises up against the Romans also. Anyways, thank you very much. Take care.